The courtroom buzzed with low chatter as the clock above the bench ticked its way toward 9. Room 5 of the Lexington Municipal Court was packed. Some had come for traffic violations, others for minor civil disputes, and a few just to watch the local judiciary in action. But none of them could have predicted the storm about to break over a seemingly trivial trespassing case. Judge Robert Langford sat tall behind his bench, his robes neatly pressed, a reputation built on being sharp, unyielding, and often ruthless. Known throughout the city as a man who did not suffer fools or sentimentality, he took particular pride in cutting through excuses like a scalpel through silk. The court clerk rose and called the case. The state of Kentucky versus Thomas Everett, charge, trespassing on private property. The heavy double doors creaked open. Heads turned, and walked an old man, moving slowly but purposefully. His coat was old but clean. His cane tapped gently on the tile with each step. His white hair was combed back neatly, and his weathered face carried lines not only of age but of memory. Thomas Everett didn't shrink from the attention, met it with quiet dignity. Some in the room exchanged puzzled looks. Others smirked. Another confused old man who wandered onto someone's lawn. Judge Langford didn't even bother hiding his disdain. He leaned back, flipping the thin case file open and shaking his head. "Mr. Everett," he began, his voice echoing, "this is your second charge of trespassing in 6 months. Do you intend to keep visiting places you're not welcome?" The old man lifted his gaze and replied evenly, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I wasn't trespassing. Not in my eyes." Langford sighed theatrically. "The law doesn't operate based on your eyes, Mr. Everett. The property is privately owned. It's been sold. That estate is not open to the public." "I know that," the old man replied, calm, almost gentle. "But I wasn't there to cause trouble. I grew up there. My father was the caretaker. That lake, those trees." Langford slammed his gavel. "Nostalgia doesn't override property laws, sir." Murmurs swelled. Langford held up a hand, silencing the room. "So why were you there?" he asked. "To remember," Thomas answered. "To remember what?" The old man's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "To see what remained of the life we built before everyone forgot who we were." The judge frowned, annoyed at the cryptic tone. "This is not a confessional, Mr. Everett. You're not here to deliver a eulogy. Do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor." "You're representing yourself?" "No," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I'm not defending myself at all." Langford stared at him, perplexed. "Then what exactly do you expect me to do?" Thomas paused, then calmly asked, "May I make a phone call before sentencing?" Snickers broke out from the gallery. Langford scoffed. "You're not at a police station. This is a courtroom." "If I'm going to jail for 30 days, Thomas replied, "I'd like to inform my daughter." Langford rolled his eyes. "Fine. Make it quick." Thomas pulled out an old flip phone, dialed a number by memory, and simply said, "Abigail, it's time." He closed the phone, slipped it back in his coat pocket, and stood still. For several seconds, nothing happened, and then the courtroom doors flew open. She walked in like a tide, coming to reclaim the sure Abigail Everett, CEO of Everett Holdings, a woman whose name was known on Wall Street, in D.C., and across media outlets for her fierce intelligence and unmatched financial instincts. Dressed in a sleek black pantsuit, heels echoing with power, she didn't pause until she reached her father. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits carried files and briefcases. "Dad," she said, gently touching his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Langford froze, color draining from his face. He knew the name. He'd seen her on Forbes, in investment headlines, on late-night financial roundtables. Abigail turned to the judge, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor, I watched your treatment of my father just now. I saw everything." Langford straightened. "Ms. Everett, I must inform you this isn't the proper." She slammed a folder onto the evidence table. "I'm not here to testify. I'm here to correct a mistake." From a folder, she pulled papers. "This document," she said, lifting it, "shows that my father, Thomas Everett, is in the final stages of purchasing the very estate you accused him of trespassing on. Langford blinked. What? My father was inspecting the property before the sale closed. We've already paid over $4 million toward acquisition. He was well within his rights to be there. Gasps spread through the room like wildfire. And this, she continued, handing the judge another paper, is proof that we notified the estate's current security team. Yet they still had him removed violentis. And your court, without so much as verifying his identity, treated him like a criminal. Langford fumbled with the documents. I had no such information. This wasn't submitted to. It was, she snapped. It was buried in your clerical stack. My legal team sent it 3 weeks ago. Signed. Certified. Stamped. Ignored. Langford's face was now pale. I also have one more document, she said, handing over a sleek black envelope. With trembling fingers, Langford opened it. Inside was a letterhead from the State Judicial Reform Committee, confirming a large donation to the Lexington Municipal Court from the Everett Justice Foundation. A fund Thomas Everett had started to modernize outdated court systems and assist underserved legal clients. In case it hasn't sunk in yet, Abigail said coldly, even the bench you sit on was paid for by the man you mocked. The courtroom was dead silent. Not even the court stenographer tapped a key. Langford, visibly shaken, tried to recover. MS. Everett, No, she interrupted. You humiliated my father. You treated a man of integrity like he was beneath you. Because of his coat. Because of his age. Because you thought no one would notice. Her voice cracked for the first time. But someone did. Thomas placed a gentle hand on his daughter's wrist. That's enough, Abby. He turned to the judge with a quiet intensity. I came today not to test the law, but to see how much humanity remains behind the robes. Langford couldn't meet his gaze. You thought I was just some poor old man, Thomas continued. And because of that, you stopped trying to understand who I really was. Langford swallowed, audibly. Mr. Everett, this court hereby dismisses all charges against you. You're free to go. Thomas nodded, slowly turning. But Abigail wasn't done. As for you, Judge Langford expect to hear from our attorneys and from the Ethics Review Board. A complaint has already been filed. Langford slumped back into his chair, defeated. As father and daughter walked out, the courtroom doors opened once more, this time to a crowd of press, their cameras already flashing. That day, an old man's quiet dignity shattered the illusion of justice administered by bias. And a courtroom, once ruled by arrogance, became the birthplace of a reckoning. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the bench, it walks in quietly on a cane, carrying the weight of a truth too long ignored. As Thomas and Abigail Everett exited the courtroom, a sea of reporters surged forward like a crashing wave. Microphones, cameras, and questions surrounded them, shouts from local affiliates, national correspondents, even international news outlets that had caught wind of the confrontation. Mr. Everett, Mr. Everett, were you aware the court didn't recognize you? MS. Everett, do you believe the judge should be removed? Is this the beginning of a legal counteraction against the court? Thomas raised a hand not to silence them, but to acknowledge their presence. He didn't speak. Abigail did. Today, she said clearly, we saw what happens when someone powerful abuses their position. But we also saw what dignity, truth, and restraint can look like in the face of ignorance. My father didn't come for revenge. He came for clarity. And now the world has it. No further questions. No grandstanding. They moved past the crowd, entered the waiting black SUV, and disappeared into the late morning traffic. But the ripples had only just begun. 2 days later, Lexington Evening News. The headline ran across every screen. Judge Robert Langford under ethics investigation after public courtroom incident with billionaire Thomas Everett. The article detailed the procedural failures, the improper dismissal of legal documents, and the conduct unbecoming of a judicial officer. The footage from the courtroom, recorded quietly by multiple attendees, had gone viral. It had over 18 million views in 48 hours. Clips flooded social media. He thought I was poor, and that's where he stopped trying to understand who I really am. Even the bench you sit on was paid for by the man you mocked. The comments were unrelenting. This should be required viewing in every law school. The quiet power of this man just shook the nation's trust in its own courts. Thomas Everett is now the face of judicial reform. Within days, local news anchors were hosting panels on implicit bias in the judiciary, and op-eds filled columns from the Washington Post to the Guardian. Legal scholars dissected Judge Langford's behavior, calling it a textbook example of visual profiling and institutional arrogance. At the judge's chambers, Robert Langford sat in his office, blinds closed, light off. His inbox was flooded with official notices. An internal memo from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. A temporary suspension order pending review. 3 law clerks had already requested reassignment. His voicemail included a terse message from the Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court. "Call me. Today." But what broke him wasn't any of that. It was the quiet envelope sitting on his desk. No return address. Just his name. He opened it, and inside was a single sentence printed in elegant script. A man's worth isn't measured by what you see, but by what you refuse to look for. It wasn't signed. He knew exactly who it came from. Meanwhile, at Everett Holdings headquarters, Abigail stood in the top-floor conference room overlooking the city skyline. Her legal team sat at the polished table before her. The senior advisor, Linda Chun, cleared her throat. "We've reviewed the judge's past rulings," she said. "There's a pattern. Language bias, disproportionate sentencing in low-income cases, especially toward older defendants or those representing themselves." Abigail didn't blink. "How far back does it go?" 7 years. "Do we have names of the wrongfully penalized?" "Yes," Linda replied. "We started reaching out to them." Abigail turned toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Her voice was low but firm. "Then let's begin. This isn't just about my father anymore. It never was." Across town, Thomas Everett's home. The old man was watering his garden when a knock came at the gate. He turned, expecting silence. Instead, he found a young woman in a navy suit, holding a letter and wearing a pin on her lapel that read, "Kentucky Law Review Investigative Division." "Mr. Everett," she said respectfully, "I wanted to say thank you. I'm the daughter of Clarice Holloway. She was sentenced by Judge Langford 5 years ago for something she didn't do. We think your case may help us reopen hers." Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then, without a word, he opened the gate. He let her in. 3 weeks later, press conference. Under a canopy of microphones and in front of a screen showing clips from courtroom footage, Abigail stepped forward. "My father has lived his entire life in service of something simple," she said. "Dignity. It has no price tag. It wears no label. It cannot be measured by the cut of your jacket or the shine on your shoes. It resides in the quiet truth of who you are when no one's looking." She paused, letting that sink in. Judge Langford failed that truth. But now, we are working with civil rights attorneys, legal advocates, and retired judges to launch the Everett Initiative for Judicial Accountability. We are committing $50 million to investigate, audit, and reform judicial behavior nationwide, starting with overlooked municipalities just like Lexington. Applause erupted. Thomas stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on his cane, his expression unreadable but calm. 6 months later, in courtroom 5 again. The room was quieter this time. On the bench now sat Judge Selena Brooks, recently appointed, progressive in philosophy and unflinching in fairness. One of her first acts? Reversing over a dozen questionable rulings issued under Langford's tenure. She paused the current case briefly and acknowledged a visitor in the gallery. "Mr. Everett," she said, "it is an honor to have you here." The court rose to applaud the man who had once stood silently at that very defendant's stand, mocked for his coat, for his cane, for his silence. But today, he stood not as a defendant. He stood as a symbol. Final scene interview with Thomas Everett. The camera lens focused in as Thomas sat in a modest armchair, a glass of tea beside him. "When I walked into that courtroom," he said, "I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for what had been lost. We built this country on the idea that justice sees the truth, not the appearance. He looked directly at the camera, eyes calm, voice steady. But I learned something that day. Sometimes, you don't raise your voice to be heard. You raise your presence. A pause. And if someone mistakes your silence for weakness, let them. Because when the truth arrives, it doesn't need to shout. Fade to black. Epilogue. Judge Langford resigned quietly. Abigail Everett was nominated for a federal advisory board on judiciary reform. The Everett Initiative opened offices in 10 states. And Thomas? He returned to that lakeside property. Only this time, it bore a plaque near the gate. Everett Preserve, in honor of the quiet strength that shakes the system.